There's a code of silence that we don't dare speak. There's a wall between us in a river so deep. We keep pretending that there's nothing wrong. There's a code of silence and it can't go on.
Hi folks, I'm Alan Watt. This is Cutting Through the Matrix on the 8th of July 2013. As always, please go into cuttingthroughthematrix.com website and help yourself to all the downloads are there for free on audio, and also transcripts are print up in most languages. Plus in Alan Watt Sentient, sentinel.eu, you'll find transcripts of the talks I've given in other languages to choose from. And I go through the system, as always, of the big system. And it truly is a system that runs the world, how it started, who started it, the purpose, the plan, the massive organizations that were created to even alter cultures across the world, and then eventually standardize them all into the same system as a globalized, into a governmental type system. And then same with the banks too, because the banks really are the boys that started up the whole process and came up with the idea 100 years ago that they should basically rule the world, at least the guys who were the international lenders to countries. These are bigger than just the banks. And they formed their own private associations, like the Royal Institute of International Affairs, Council on Foreign Relations, the same name really in other countries. And they've got them in all countries now. They've been putting in presidents and prime ministers and now it really is about 100 years. And the public don't know. They vet the ones at the top, they put in their own players on both sides or all sides, depending on how many parties you have. And of course, they prefer two. It's much easier to control everything that way. And we've been along their agenda ever since, basically. Their own historian was Carol Quigley, who's a professor, and he talked about it back in the 1960s, and documented it in two of his books, actually. And he goes through the system and the plan, etc., etc. You tie in the other players that were associated with the same group, and you'll find that the futurists and so on, even Aldous Huxley was well acquainted with them and took part in their think tanks for designing the future, and Lord Bertrand Russell and many, many others at the top, and big societies and agencies, all not-for-profit organizations, but they were worth billions of dollars even back then, set up their organizations to bring through charitable works and philanthropy, armies of non-governmental organizations that would really lobby on behalf of what the big boys wanted. It would appear to the general public as though it was all coming from the public, but in reality these are all managed groups that help shape your mind by protesting or demanding and so on. And government, which is in on the whole secret, is quite happy to take that into consideration and pass laws based on all the lobbying that it gets. So we're living through a planned agenda. The general public are left out of the picture. We're given lots of rubbish they call news, but nothing really makes much difference. It's all nonsense, basically, that you're given. Because the press, all the boys that took over the press a long time ago, are all part of this big system. They all belong at the top, all the moguls and all the top editors, etc., and lots of the main journalists on television and in print, all are members of the Council on Foreign Relations, or Royal Institute of International Affairs, as is known in Britain, and the same groups across the world. The politicians, all of them in Europe, the European Union, are all members of it too. And that group, actually, that European Council on Foreign Relations, is run by George Soros, who's also part of the act. You always think that there's opposing groups. There's no opposing groups. It's a dialectic. You can't get change unless you have an opposition to what's already there. And then starts the debate, and then the people in the middle, which is the general population, have their experts come on and tell them which way to go with things. It constantly changes because you're going in the same path in a zigzag direction, left, right, left, right, left, right. That's how it works. All towards a predetermined goal. And it's very old, as I say. Go back to H.G. Wells, who was also a propagandist for the same group. And he was a lot of his material, in fact, for his writings, sci-fi and non-fiction, were given to him by the big foundations. And he was a member of the Fabian Society, a founding member, in fact. Back with more after this. Hi folks, we're back cutting through the matrix, talking about the system. That's all you have really is the system. And most folk don't even know there is a system that they live through that was designed before they were born. They don't know the groups that are ruling it. They don't know that even their thoughts, their fashion, even their tattoos and ideas like that are all given to them and promoted through the culture industry, which is also a big part of it. Because you cannot bring in a global type society of a global plantation, you might say, with an ultra elite that you've never had before in history, never such a rich ultra elite as the rakings and profit just accumulate like never before in this day and age, because of the whole of China and that they're invested in with slave labor and they're raking in the cash like you wouldn't believe. And of course the United Nations, which is all part of it too, because the same group created the United Nations, they do their left-wing part and push out all the stats every year, and they were always telling you for the last 40 years that the gap between the rich and the poor is widening. Well, now it's not a gap, it's like a different planet they're on, because you can't imagine how they live today with incredible amounts of money, trillions of dollars, some of them, like each. Anyway, reality is far different from what you're given at the bottom. You're meant to believe that we're stumbling down through time and crises just come out of nowhere and politicians get together and just work on the problem and eventually solve it one way or another. And that's how we're taught. That's called the accidental view of history. That's what they want you to believe in. And they want you really to believe in your governments and so on, even all through the Cold War it became evident in countries like Britain or the US that there was another government at work here, and they even asked it was the CIA, NSA and all these guys and MI6, etc. are really a parallel or a separate government. And well, they are, because they're answerable basically to nobody. And remember too, getting back to the original thing about the system and the guys who created this system. These boys, who were already, as I say, the big moguls of their day, international lenders who lent to nations and kept the bookkeeping for nations back then even, with their debt and all the rest of it and their interest, decided to take up and make a system more easily manageable for themselves and their own offspring down through the future. And how do you do that? How do you control the future? Well, you plan the future. People are really taught to believe it just happens by itself, as I say, the accidental view of history. But of course, everything you read, and even what I read on here, there's a lot of stuff there to tell you of the big organizations that have already mapped out the next 20, 50, 100 years and where they want to go. And they're all either big NGOs or their foundations themselves, all paid by other foundations. You might call them the founding foundations that finance them all. And they all started up a long, long time ago, tax-free and tax-exempt foundations that also are made up by guys who own the big banking systems across the world from 100 years to the present. So we're going through a planned thing, and everything really is that way. And as I say, even to do with fashion, every liberation thing that you get for whomever it happens to be at the time is spearheaded by the same people, funded by the same people, in order to change and alter society. Destruction of the family unit was one, because they decided it was an old concept, they wouldn't need it in the future, for all the peasants at the bottom, that is. And they wanted to eventually bring down the populations of certain people first of all, and then the rest gradually. And that's been underway for your whole life, actually. And this stuff's all, again, documented too. People forget that even at the end of World War II, the king in Britain had a big world meeting held to do with, not enough folk have died in the war, so we're going to bring down the population sooner, because that was getting the hype that he was getting fed from his think tanks that were employed by the same private organizations. So we're going through a planned system. And as I say, what you do, how do you get people to stop marrying and so on? Well, you simply make them promiscuous and encourage it. And then you give them the pill, and then give them free abortions, and then you make them think, they're taught to think that any disease they get will be cured. And of course that's not true at all. Now, whatever we get as news is either obsolete, or old, or disinformation, or partial truth. And your opinion can be swayed primarily by the omission of any other side of the story, or even a part of the story, you understand? And that's how a lot of it is done as well. I've gone through, and people should really use the archives at cuttingthroughthematrix.com. I've gone through in the past many articles from think tanks and so on, talking about this very, very subject, how to do it, how it's done and so on, how it works, where they have to improve their techniques, etc., on the general population. And unfortunately, the general population are called the proles, just like you had with Aldous Huxley, who had it in his book, not Huxley, I should say. Yeah, he did have it in his book, Brave New World. And so did Orwell as well, George Orwell, the proles. The proles don't count. That's what Orwell said. And the idea being that the people at the bottom, and that's the majority of the public, remember, the majority of the public are never let in on the truth. In fact, they're hardly given a glimmer of any truth. And if the truth has to come out in some way or another, it's so diluted, you really don't know why things are really happening. That's how you're given your reality. And those who've studied various tyrants through history, totalitarian regimes, and read the memoirs even of guys who led these totalitarian regimes, or those around them who worked with them, they understood perfectly the system of how to grab power and how to hold on to it, and also what they thought of the ordinary people whom they'd all use. And what they said, and in many cases is unfortunately true. They weren't speaking off the top of their hat. They were actually basically doing it from studying history itself. And of course, these very techniques are used in the think tanks themselves, because your own governments put in dictators across the world. They'll always have done. And other times they'll put in a thing called democracy. And the democracy is just a puppet government, a puppet regime, which must be standardized to the West. And they must emulate it completely and join the World Bank and take money from the World Bank and pay to the IMF massive compound interest rates, etc., etc. If they don't do that, they'll be simply annihilated, as is happening across the Middle East right now. And there's many players engaged in this, of course. Some players are really into their own particular people or tribe or whatever. But the ones with the most money, obviously, and their tribal and instinct and everything else will obviously be at the top. But getting back to the fact that all news we get is old news or whatever, I mentioned before about some of the history of the G8 to G20 and all the G-whizzes we had before that, because it started, I think it was a G4, the Grand Four, as they called them at the time, during the Cold War. And now it's G20 you've got. Now, this goes back to the same group, again, Council on Foreign Relations, Royal Institute of International Affairs, that decided to amalgamate countries into blocks, supposedly under the guise of trading. And of course, what they did initially was to make it secret to the general public, or from the public, not to know. They shouldn't know that they're going to amalgamate their countries legally, financially, and politically as well. And that's still on the go. In fact, Rompuy, the EU, the head of the EU, the strange little character, has already said that. Again, I've got an archive section at cuttingthroughthematrix.com, that the nation state is dead, it's obsolete. And so they had to lie from the beginning as they were setting up the EU under free trade deals and so on that would benefit everybody, create massive jobs and all the rest of it. Well, you see how the lies worked out there. Whenever you're given this carrot and stick thing, oh, you better all join, you better all do this or you'll be left behind. Whenever you hear that term, you're being conned. And there's had many schemes the same way. It's done the same thing over and over again. They've all been conned. Same with the Trans-Pacific Partnership they've got on the go right now. You've got to join it or you'll be left behind. And it's going to create jobs. Of course, the jobs, when they first mentioned all that kind of stuff during Cretin's time in Canada, was that he didn't tell you that it was telling the truth for once, but it was all to be jobs in China. Now, again, part of the deal with the Royal Institute of International Affairs was not only to amalgamate, but also to eventually, through all these binding treaties, etc., draw your countries together into a system. And first they'd bring up these little associations, which again, like G4, G8, G20s and all the rest of it, to simply rubber stamp treaties and agreements were drafted up by hundreds and hundreds of what they call Sherpas. These guys work full time for government, and their job as high bureaucrats is to go around the world trying to fix any disagreements before they sign big integration deals, not just on trade, but in financing, who pays what, etc., etc., etc. And it's all to do with total amalgamation into what they call global governance. They don't want to say government because they don't want to scare the average person that even hears that term today, which is out there, away from it, you see. Now, again, long ago, the guys at the top believed that they were already the most superior people on the planet. They set up the Royal Institute of International Affairs. The proof was obviously in the fact they'd created wealth down through centuries, intermarried and held on to it. And their sons generally didn't go wayward and do odd things. They would go into the same industry and they would be just as formidable to all their opponents and stick to the family's traditions in the same agenda down through time. And that's still on the go today. They're completely evolutionists in a certain sense, and more so even pre-Darwinian, in fact. And we've got it all here today. So the G20, as I say, was a part of it, and eventually they tie them all together, and the G20 has to go up eventually to include a lot more countries, and to bring all the world under this big forum. Now, no one in any of the countries gets to vote on even the establishing of any of these G20 joiners. Nobody does. And yet they're still prattling about democracy. And yet these guys are now international. The guy who you think leads your country, and I say think leads your country, is an internationalist. And he signs all the agreements with these other guys to be more internationalist and to lose sovereignty as well. The old arguments to do with sovereignty and loss of sovereignty and even to do with protectionism were debated a long time ago. The old idea being that and even in politics, and the old idea of democracy, which even was given to the public by the same group first to get used to it, was that you had to have a local representative to go to a place that they could meet and represent you. Well, with big, massive nations, it's almost impossible to know who these guys are, never mind where they go to. Back with more after this. Hi folks, we're back cutting through the matrix, talking about the system and to do with the big officially unofficial organizations that just form themselves, made up of prime ministers and presidents across the world without the authority of the people. And of course, all you need is a few years and folk take it all for granted. We are very adaptable. We take everything for granted very quickly, in fact. But here's an example here because the G20 recently came out with that. I mean, I've been following it for years, and I may even read this article when it came out, in fact, from 2010, to do with the bail-ins, because recently, getting back to recent times, they came out again at the G20 and talked about the bail-ins and so on, and we'll have the Cyprus affair. Most folk have forgotten already, and their hair's back growing in again after it got shaved. But the thing is, this article came out here, says, this is when all the major governments of the G20 first agreed to implement the new Cyprus-style bail-in regime in the direction of the Internationalist Financial Stability Board under its new GFC-enabled broadened mandate it was called. And that was done on Armistice Day 2010. So this is how old things really are. You think they're just happening now and they all get to, what can we do? Oh, let's make a bail-in. And then, of course, they'll all pass laws just in the last 2 or 3 months to allow bail-ins to be, meaning robbing their depositors, in other words. They can rob the depositors of all their money in all the countries. So it goes back to 2010, and the G20 first talked about this quietly in 2010. See, everything happens today. I've mentioned this before. Nothing happens by chance in a big scale. It's all known about for years in advance. In fact, it's planned to happen years in advance. And this is what they do with the G20s. They have their big meals and so on, and fancy do's, and they bring in the prostitutes even for them too. We know about that. It's come out in the papers in Canada before. They hire them, even boys and young ones, whatever their fancy is for all the different foreigners. And that's all acceptable. Things that are a criminal offence in your own country are okay for this bunch when they come in. This has been happening for years. All their global agendas. And I remember the excuse years ago at one of the global meetings in Canada, it was BC, they said, well, you see, some of these people have different preferences and so on and so on. It's okay in their countries, etc., etc. And so we have to supply them here. Just like that. So laws are, again, different strokes for different folks. Say different laws for, depends who you are. Maybe different laws for bigger paws, I say. Anyway, it says here, you can't help but laugh at the Orwellian doublespeak slogans used by the architects of the new regime. So to address the problem of systematically important banks without exposing the taxpayer to the risks of loss, the puppet politicians agreed to confiscate the savings of the taxpayers. And it says you can't make this stuff up. It says you may be thinking that this excerpt from the FSB press release does not prove that the G20 have specifically agreed to confiscation of bank deposits. And you would be correct. That was back then. They have now. It says, as with all such schemes, it's not intended that the public will easily discover what's been planned. You have to wade carefully through all the verbose and deliberately obtuse technocrat-ese, all the bureaucratic babble, and cross-reference the supporting documents and their annexes in order to discover just what the G20 attendee politicians, geniuses like the world's greatest treasurer Wayne Swan, have actually signed up to. And on the site, they give you actually what the charters that they signed back then in 2010. It says, with one word, bail-in stamped clearly on its barrel, you find that you wade through all this stuff. I'm glad there are people, and I do it too sometimes. I used to do a lot more than I do today. But you can wade through lots and lots of boring stuff to find out what the real point is buried under it all. This is first in the FSB press release of 4th November 2011. We're told that the G20 allegedly asked the FSB to develop a policy framework to address the systemic and moral hazard risks associated with systemically important financial institutions. Next, in Seoul in 2010, G20 leaders endorsed this framework and the timelines and processes for its implementation. The framework is set out in the FSB's key attributes of effective resolution regimes for financial institutions. It's a PDF link there too. I'll put that up tonight too. In the preamble of the document, we'll learn that one of the objectives is to make it possible for unsecured and uninsured creditors to absorb losses. Meaning if your savings are not covered by some form of government guarantee or federal insurance, for all that's worth, it says here, or if, as in Australia, the government bank deposits guarantee is limited to an amount significantly less than, let's say, 1/10 of the total actual bank deposits held by the public, then your bank account can be made to absorb losses. And as we shall see, this will be done entirely without your consent. Well, everything is done without your consent, really. It says in the sub-points of the preamble, we see that G20 governments are expected to have in place a recovery and resolution plan containing all elements set out in Annex 3. And again, I'll put these links up tonight too, and you can see them for yourself. And it says the resolution authority's powers are most interesting. For example, we can all applaud the idea that such an authority could not, that they actually would, claw back bankers' bonuses. See, that throws the average person off. They'll stop there and say, oh, okay, it's just get the nasty big rich sods at the top. It says what's of serious concern, though, is power to transfer or sell assets and liabilities, legal rights and obligations. They can sell all that off, including deposit liabilities and ownership in shares to a solvent third party without consent. It's confirmed in the key attribute 3.3, where it is clearly stated that any transfer of a bank's assets or liabilities, such as deposits, by the authorities should not require the consent of any interested party or creditor to be valid. It was all done years ago, folks. Back with more after this.
You're listening to the Republic Broadcasting Network, because you can handle the truth.
Hi folks, we're back cutting through the matrix. Talking about the big banking systems, of course, and the money boys. They really run the world. I mean, money's at the top of the whole pyramid here. At least those who own the money. And the money to them is a tool at the top for total power. That's all it is. Everything runs on it. Below it's like a food for everyone, you see. It's like water in a sense. It trickles down until there's maybe a drop at the bottom. But this is the whole idea of how it's run. It's very, very simple. And these big guys at the top are so powerful, incredibly powerful, that they can simply, if anybody didn't go along with their big agenda and their plan, they'd simply, not that anybody would disagree to do it, they'd simply cut them off and crash their economy overnight. So simple. Which has been done before, by the way. But according to this article, it goes on to say here that the G20 actually passing this back in 2010 and so on. It says, resolution powers should be exercised in a way that respects the hierarchy of the claims while providing flexibility to depart from the general principle of equal pari proposi treatment of creditors of the same class, it says. It says this is what happened in Cyprus. While the final details are still evolving as to how much the Cypriot depositors holding move or more or less than €100,000 will have stolen from them, what's clear that the FSB template for the bail-ins in G20 nations or jurisdictions is the one being followed. What's also clear, especially in light of the recent revelations, that Canada has expressly identified bail-in procedures in their 2013 budget, and I've got the link up at my archive section too. I read the article at the time, but I'll put it up again tonight, is that all Western governments have, unbeknown to their citizens and without their consent, agreed to the imposition of the same new regime for managing insolvent banks. And so that the regime is devised and dictated by an unelected central body. And you keep voting and say, you keep prattling about democracy. There's even idiots that keep cheering about all these colour revolutions and the paid mercenaries that are causing havoc across the Middle East and cheating them on because they're going to bring democracy across. No, they're going to bring this system across the world, and believe you me, there's no democracy in it. That's the truth. Anyway, it says that the FSB has been established to coordinate at the international level the work of national financial authorities and international standard-setting bodies, and to develop and promote the implementation of effective regulatory, supervisory and other financial sector policies. Brings together national authorities responsible for financial stability in significant international financial centres, international financial institutions, sector-specific international groupings of regulators and supervisors and committees of central bank experts. And that's according to the FSB's own website. Now, remember too, going back into Carol Quigley's talks in his books as well, on this big global system, he was all part of it. He talks about eventually the Bank for International Settlements would help run the world and actually rule it, and through their IMF, they would also be the debt collectors. And basically all the private centralized banks are owned privately by really a few people when it boils down to it. What power you have over the whole planet, eh? Total power. And this is happening as we speak, as we live through it. Most people are oblivious. Of course, they'll stay oblivious. I've always thought that the greatest crime that could be created to anyone is to rob their ability of knowing their own reality as soon as you're born. I can take it further, in fact, and go into the writings of Lord Bertrand Russell, who talked about dumbing down the public by different techniques of putting stuff in their food and their water, and even by use of the needle. He says the needle, very important for vaccinations. And so they're hitting you before you were born. But the fact is, once you're born, the cartoons start, and you're indoctrinated very, very early on into political correctness and updates and so on. And you're told what kind of future you're supposed to believe in, and what is okay to believe in, and what you're supposed to believe in, and what you better not think about, and so on and so on. That's how tightly you're really conditioned. And for most folk, it really works so well. They can go through their life fighting world wars even, and go to their deaths never knowing they've been conned their entire life, never knowing, conned in so many ways. They'll never ever know. What a crime that is, really. But I'll put this link up tonight, and you can look it up for yourself at cuttingthroughmatrix.com. Also, as they amalgamate all the banking system, the total power of the top banks together for world dominance, they come out with this one too. It says the EU, the European Union. Remember, the European Union was first devised or mentioned by Karl Marx, who was also financed by the same boys that set up the Royal Institute for International Affairs, Council on Foreign Relations. But he was paid to write all his stuff in London with a lot of help from friends and so on, and various professors that were supplied to him. But he talked about there would be a complete integration eventually. It says the EU arrest warrant needs urgent reform. And it says that European arrest warrants, the flagship measure of the EU judicial cooperation, has helped to catch people who exploit Europe's open borders to flee justice. But it doesn't always work as intended. The challenge facing the EU institutions is how to address the shortcomings without undermining its effectiveness. After years of calls for reform, the European Parliament, under the rapporteurship of British Liberal MEP Sarah Ludford, is about to do a legislative initiative report. What they want to do, and they've been at this for ages, is to try and amalgamate all their laws. See, it's just like a country. The US started off as different states, remember. Remember too that the great President Lincoln was congratulated by Karl Marx by telegraph for helping centralize the government, a prime tenet of total control for even communism or Marxism. And don't forget that the big boys who invented it were also the top bankers. That's why they like it, you see. You can get controlled society that way. You have your own, you can mandate your system's the only one to be used, your system of money is the only one to be used, etc. And you can mandate the wages and everything else. It's not bad for capitalists, you know. But it says here, it should be welcomed by the Assembly, which had no decision-making role back when the EEW was adopted in the pre-Lisbon Treaty times. Ludwig said will look to issues of proportionality and observance of human rights. But and you always see the attack on human rights like that's, and sure enough, most people goes to sleep. You know, wow, that's good. You know. And so I hope that thereby British participation in the EU criminal justice issues can be ensured for the future. Then they go into the flaws in the EAW. And so they want to change it all. So you change their laws. Now they've already been changing all the economic laws. Remember too, the IMF wants to eventually do all the bookkeeping. Actually, it gave itself the power to do all the bookkeeping of all the countries. So the countries are not national anymore, or sovereign, or independent. Or anything. No, they're completely bought. It's a new Soviet empire. It's a more sophisticated, advanced form of the Soviet empire. That's what it is. In fact, there were guys who were dissidents in the Soviet era, and I read them years ago in there, who came out and said that. They were allowed to go and listen to the parliament and meet them all, and they actually said, this is the real Soviet empire now. It's here. Soviet empire, remember, multi-billionaires all fled out of Russia when they supposedly decided it was time to take down the wall, as they called it. It was all planned for years in advance. And these billionaires just flooded out, mainly to the States, with all their cash. Other ones went to even the Middle East. And it's well documented. You can look up yourself if you care. And what can you do? It's a great system, as I say, you know, for making lots of cash. Because the state technically owns everything, but they can also, just like here too, public-private deals, they can farm out to certain things to private businesses. What's beautiful in the Soviet Union too, and I think Adam Curtis went through that in some of his documentaries, was to do with the so-called fall of Russia, the Soviet regime. And it was astonishing that the Federal Reserve sent over their guys who've done such a great job here. You know, they're so open, and they get elected too, don't they? You all elect them, right? Of course you do. And they went over there, and supposedly in a week they were supposed to introduce democracy and capitalism. And what they did was got all these state-owned, taxpayer-funded, or the people-funded, massive oil corporations, gas, electricity, everything and so on. And they're supposed to distribute bonds for everyone across the country to take their share of it. And it was arranged months and months, actually years in advance, by those in the know inside America, before the wall came down. And they'd already planned who's going to give all these bonds to. It wasn't the general population. And we know the history of that is these big, they call it a mafia, and grabbed them all, of course, and became overnight the big tycoons of Russia. And Putin had an awful job trying to put some of them back in their place. But who's going to believe in a farce? Let's introduce democracy in a week. Because it was such a surprise that it all happened. What a joke. But they do love that. They love to privatize stuff that the public build up. They've done it in every country over the last 100-odd years. And then when it's time, like the railroad system too, when it's time to repair things, they get this nationalized again, and taxpayer funds all the repairs and updates everything and replaces things, and then they go and privatize it again for peanuts. This is a con, folks. Happens in every country. There's a massive rail car smash in Quebec just over the weekend there, and I think 60 to 80 people they say could be missing, meaning dead, in this town where this stack of oil carriages carrying, well, we don't know if it was just all crude oil or if it was gasoline or what, wasn't it? But it blew up and flattened houses and buildings and everything. And they're really clamping down on the lid on it too, because you see this is becoming more frequent, because before that, about a month before that, I had the same thing happen just a half a mile from me. And a bridge collapsed. Now, since they privatized the system, And I looked into this, and they fired the union, basically. I mean, it's companies in New York based, mainly that own them now. The CN Railway and Trans-Canada, Pacific Railway. They basically have slashed at the bone, just like the old corporate raiders did. And they maximize the profit and do as little maintenance as possible. And it's going to happen. It's happening all the time. Then I looked into the owners of the one in Quebec, and it's also with a company in Maine. And it turns out to be a world holding company for railroad lines. One corporation is holding almost all the world's railroad system. One company. Now, holding companies don't make anything. It's like the Wall Street movie, the first one. We own it all. We don't make anything. All they make is money. Because they have the controlling interest in the shares and so on. And the first thing they do is maximize the profit. They pass on the word down below to the company CEO that works in the actual company. And it's his problem how to maximize the profit. But they've taken over railroad lines across the old Soviet Union, the same company, across the States, Canada, Latvia, even into Guatemala. Have that too. And believe you me, there's a bigger network behind all this because it's all the same. They know exactly who's going to help them out in these countries. And they've got a lot in common with a lot of these folk in these countries that got into politics and so on. It's quite fascinating to go through the history of these things. But what a power they have. They can bring the complete standstill, basically, almost all the big bulk of trade in a nation, within a nation, or outside a nation, almost overnight. And again, too, they've got all these public-private partnerships where the public pay for all the maintenance and they rake in all the profit. That's when they bother to do maintenance. But as I say, as they're getting more and more frequent in all these smashes because that's what you get when you do privatize them, especially into a holdings company that literally owns, dozens and dozens and dozens of companies across the planet. But really nobody in the company that owns it, the holding company, even visits them. Same if they have factory holding companies, they don't even go and visit the factory, just like the Wall Street movie. That's how it really is in this world. And believe you me, the politicians won't say it. That's why they clam up about all these massive accidents. Because these guys also make sure that they've got the right boys in politics, and they make sure too that they're all provided money to run their campaigns and so on. They're all bought off. What do you expect in a system where they're allowed to take so-called private contributions, which also include corporations as persons? Anyway, that's how it is. Also, too, this is kind of boring because everything to do with electronics and privacy, to me, is awfully boring because I knew from the beginning there would be none before we even started, in fact. Because you had none before that, even during the times before 9/11 and so on, you had no privacy then either. Any forms of communication means power. Your governments, as I say, had Cardex systems in the 50s all across the European countries, including Britain, and into America as well, on every citizen that was under their jurisdiction. Every citizen. With all information, including trivia or gossip, believe it or not. And, of course, when those phones become more and more affordable in countries like Europe, and more folk were getting them, they were snooping on folk from the very beginning. All forms of communication have always been done like that. But this one here says that Apple and Google are excused from the Irish tax questioning. There's questioning going on about their systems and so on. And it says Apple and Google are off the hook now when it comes to an investigation to how they use the Irish tax system. Apple, Google and other multinational companies were originally called to talk about their tax setups in Ireland, such as arrangements, had come under fire recently. These companies were accused of dodging taxes in other countries by a special route through Ireland. However, Clarence Lynch, chairman of the Irish Parliament's Finance Committee, cleared company executives from Apple and Google from having to explain their tax situations with Ireland. According to Lynch, there's no need for Ireland to have a tax investigation when the US Senate Subcommittee and the UK's Public Accounts Committee are doing the same already. So, literally, democracy, yeah. And also the article I'm sure you've all read too, and it's delaying the employer mandate requires delaying all of Obamacare because it says IRS has announced it will postpone the start date of Obamacare's employer mandate from 2014 to 2015. Most of the reaction is focused on how the move is an explicit or implicit acknowledgement that Obamacare is harmful, can't work, and will prove a liability for Democrats going to the November 2014 elections, it says here. It'll be more than just that, believe you me. And it's not why they call it Obamacare. Hillary Clinton was prattling about that when her husband was in the office doing his, cigar smoking and blowing rings and doing strange things. But anyway, she talked about it then, about universal health care. She had lots and lots of speeches about it all over the place. This is an ongoing thing. And don't think you just jump into the other camp. It's the same camp, folks, I always think America with the eagle and the wings spread, the left wing, the right wing, and behind the shield is a body. You never see what the body looks like because there's a shield in front of it, you see. But even at that, the bird's got the same head, doesn't it? So you don't fall into it too, because the ones who are going to have, again, it's all to do with monopolization until there's one massive industry at the top, one company, or even a holding company eventually that'll own the insurance companies beneath it, or it could just be one big insurance company. Everything sounds so wonderful as they push it, and they even try to get you enthusiastic about it too. I'm not saying that the present system is good. It's not. It's incredibly, ridiculously, greedily expensive. Back with more after this. Hi folks, we're back cutting through the matrix and talking about the big system again, and going back to the first article to do with the bank bailouts or haircuts or bail-ins, as I like to call them, meaning stealing your money. Again, in free trade and the Council of Foreign Relations, that they drafted up, remember, all the agreements for the free trade agreements for Canada, the NAFTA agreements for Canada, the US, Mexico, and so on. And they're still at it yet. They also boasted too they did the one for Europe. And in other words, it's the same organization as the Royal Institute of International Affairs. You see, they couldn't call it Royal in the States. It didn't sound too good. But eventually one day it will, because in the States they love celebrities and they love folk who are awfully wealthy and show it. But this article ties in exactly what I said. The whole idea was to bind the countries together through trade deals, and then economic deals, banking deals and so on. Talks with Japan began late last year about the Trans-Pacific Partnership with Japan, for instance. They're one of the countries in it. So I think the US, at least the Obama administration, claim they're past it okay for the US to join with Japan in the free trade deal. Remember, free trade deals came out with, again, the Royal Institute of International Affairs to bind the world under one system which they control. And eventually they would do away with the levies on taxes on imports. You see, you could call it import duties, which is a form of protectionism. And as I said before, if you can't look after your own people in your immediate area, you have no control at all. That's what protectionism was about. And it was to ensure jobs at home. It was to ensure there's enough food and decent food for those left at home, and all that before exports came. And it also paid for most of the government, by the way. The import duties from abroad would pay for the government. Remember, too, that your taxes are also going up because as they push through all these free trade agreements and do away with the import duties, they aren't going to say, oh, well, we're going to go broke. No, they're going to say, your taxes at home, the taxpayers at home will have to just pay more and more taxes to make up the difference from all the import duties they won't have. And it says, so anyway, this is, they're ready to go ahead, it says, with Japan and so on. Trade deal, and Japan can bring its cars in. Before they had a levy on every car, a rather expensive one too, so that folk would buy domestically, but what's the point anymore, since you find really you have no domestic cars made almost. And even the ones that you thought were yours were already international corporations. They're churning out more in other countries than they are back home. But I'll put this one up tonight too for those who are following the whole free trade agreements and so on, as they bring binding treaties, remember. Remember too, a lot of your food has to be exported abroad now too, so another concern of the old system was to make sure that you were given enough available, decent, good foods, and there's more and more foods getting sold abroad. I read last week where the US is, a lot of their pork industry is getting bought over by China, and they're exporting some of the best stuff to China. The best stuff. What does that leave you? Well, you won't notice because you'll get it in pre-packaged and processed foods and so on, covered in sauces. You won't even know what you're eating. I'm not kidding about this. It's already happened here. That's how it's done, folks. You know. But again, this is a PR article from the Globe and Mail, making it sound all rosy and wonderful. And we can import rice from Japan. There's a glut of rice right now, rice all over the world right now, from all the countries. A glut of it. But anyway, it doesn't matter because I say the big boys at the top control it all, and it's not the ones you elect. It really isn't. From Hamish myself from Ontario, Canada, it's good night. May a God or your gods go with you.